Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the second video of troubleshooting the abandoned Husqvarna and trying to get this thing back to running and operational condition. So if you've seen the previous video, you already know that we got this thing running. However, there were some issues that I needed to address because it wasn't running on its own. If you haven't seen the video, you can go ahead and click on my channel and go see it. And also, if you do like my content, I appreciate if you give me a like, consider subscribing, hitting the notification bell, so you don't miss out on any of the latest uploads. It does help tremendously with the YouTube algorithm, and it also helps support my channel in a way. So without further ado, let's jump into this video and see what I had to do to get this thing running again. So yeah guys, first things first, like I said, if you've seen the other video, you already know there was an oil leak issue with these quick releases. That was one of the first things that I had to address, because I did put some oil into it and I did tighten this thing. There's a fitting that these plastics quick release sits on. So basically it's a threaded fitting that screws into the block. And the issue is, a lot of times they're not that tight, or over time they'll get loose and they'll start leaking oil. So with this one, I did tighten it as much as I can, but apparently it wasn't tight enough, because when I came into the garage the following day, there was actually a spot of oil, so it was still leaking. And yeah, I had to address that. So what I ended up doing is I pulled the whole fitting out, unscrewed it from the block, I cleaned it up, I put some Teflon tape and put it back in. However, it was still get moist, and when I put the oil, it was still having a very slow leak. Well, we can't really call it a leak, but it would definitely start leaking eventually. And what it is these caps inside, they have two O-rings. So I have the O-rings right here. So here's one, the bigger one, and then there's one that goes on the tip of the fitting, and these are almost rock hard. So they even broke as I tried to take them out. So yeah, these O-rings were actually bad, and that was another issue. So new O-rings in, fitting with Teflon tape, everything tight, everything good. The second issue is, if you remember, we had problem with this thing being left with bad gas. So I did drain the whole fuel system, and I said I was going to pull the carburetor out and possibly have it cleaned. I have not done that. What I did is completely drain the system, and this thing actually has a reserve tank. So it has a valve in the back. So I had to drain. See, there's a reserve that switches from the main to the reserve. So I drained the tank completely. All the bad gas is out, and put a new fuel filter. So I got original Kohler fuel filter in, and then actually blew some compressed air before I put the filter. Blew some compressed air through the line, make sure the line was completely clear. Put the new fuel filter, put some high octane fuel in it. Did the oil change, so we put the new filter and put the proper 10W30 synthetic oil in it. And I went to go ahead and start it, and I was still having an issue. If you remember for the previous video, we had no power going to the starter solenoid, and it wasn't starting, so I had to jump it from the solenoid. However, when I was actually doing the work off camera, it kind of clicked. Well, that's a weird choice of word, but it clicked that the solenoid was not clicking, if that makes any sense. So if you do have a bad solenoid, you still should actually have some sound coming from it. Usually it would just click or make noise, but you wouldn't get power. So you get your main power from the battery, it goes to one terminal, then you have a ground, and basically these two are ground until you turn the ignition switch, and then one of these wires will send a positive signal to the starter solenoid, and then in terms you'll get power going to the terminal to the starter. So what was going on is I was getting no power, so we had to jump the solenoid. Long story short, I figured out in the first video that it was just bad solenoid, so I didn't think much of it. But now when I was doing everything else, putting the mower back together, it turns out that I wasn't hearing nothing from the solenoid. So I was like, let me check it again with the test light. So what happened was I checked the wire, and we do have signal coming from the ignition switch when you turn it. However, still nothing happening. So we're still not getting any power from the solenoid going to the starter. So I go ahead and check the ground wire, and I had ground. So I was like, okay, there's gotta be something else happening because it doesn't make sense. So I check it again with the ignition switch in the on position, and what happens is the ground disappears. So automatically I'm thinking, okay, so it has something to do with one of the safety switches. It's shorting the circuit somewhere. So I start tracing. I'll go into this rabbit hole. I start tracing and checking all the switches. So here's your brake switch. So I've tested that. I tested the seat switch. I tested the reverse switch that's down on the transmission. I've actually jumped a bunch of them, doing a combination of jumping one switch and then releasing the other. Everything I did, and I was still not getting this thing to run. It would just not get any power. As soon as you turn the ignition switch, the ground just disappears. So I'm not getting any more ground. So, and what happened was I disconnected this ground wire and just ran ground from the engine directly to the solenoid. You turn the ignition and it's perfectly fine. So it'll start. So solenoid was working. But when I plug the ground wire that's from the original harness, the ground just disappears as soon as you turn the ignition. And it doesn't matter if you're actually turning it to the start position or you're just turning it to the ignition on. Any of these positions, the ground goes away. So I start tracing the wire, start tracing the ground wires, and I go all the way back into the ignition switch, and it was doing the same thing. So these two black wires back here are basically the ground. And when I tested it back here, it was doing the same thing. So automatically I was like, okay, well, then probably the ignition switch itself is bad, and that's why I'm losing the ground as soon as I turn it. So I went and grabbed another ignition switch from another Husqvarna. I put it in. Guess what? Exact same thing happens. At that point, I was getting so frustrated. I had an off day already, and this thing was not helping. So I started tracing the wire, and I see the ground wire. It goes to the hour meter. So I didn't notice it before, but the hour meter wasn't working, even when I had the power and everything. So I checked it with the test light, and it was the same thing. Turn the ignition on, power goes away. So at this point, I was like, okay, I cannot just run a ground directly to the solenoid because there's something else going on. The whole grounding circuit, somewhere there is a fault in the wire harness. At this point, I was like, okay, we're going to have to dive deeper into this thing, start pulling the battery tray and all that so I can get access to the whole harness. And you can see I had the sheeting pulled away, and I started pulling on the black wire. I started tracing it from the ignition switch going down and see where I was losing the connection. And then there was one black wire right here that goes down, and I started pulling on it and trying to see where it goes next. But apparently it just kept pulling. I pulled maybe like 6 inches, and then it hit me. I was like, man, in the last video when I was taking the hood off, there was the wiring harness for the headlight was actually cut. Somebody had already cut the wire harness for the headlights, and the bulbs and everything was missing out of the hood. And then it hit me. This, guys, was the dumbest thing that really had me chasing my tail for over an hour, just checking and double checking and triple checking everything. And it turns out that in the circuits on these mowers, what they do is they will run a wire from one point to the next, and then they would splice it and then jump to the next point. So the issue I had was the wire that was coming from the ignition. It was coming down to the headlight harness, And when they cut the harness, basically they cut the joining piece or the jumper cable that's supposed to feed back the ground to the next point, which is one of the safety switches, then the next safety switch, the reverse switch, and so on and so on and so forth until it gets to the solenoid. So because of that one harness for the headlights that was cut, I was losing ground and the solenoid was not being grounded, and that's why I couldn't start the mower. And after an hour, it's finally done. So far the engine runs perfect. There's absolutely no oil leaks. It's not smoking. It's not misfiring or backfiring or doing anything else. There is some noise coming from the clutch. I am going to investigate that. That's my next stop, and also I'm going to have to go through the deck, take the belt off. I did test it. It does run and drive, so I know the transmission is fine. I haven't checked the stage of the belt, if it's dry rotted or not. I didn't hear any pulling noise. But my next stop is going to be the deck. I have to take that belt off and actually check all the pulleys and the spindles, make sure they're fine, and have to find out why the PTO clutch is making a rattling noise. There's a metal on metal type noise, so I don't know if it's the bracket that's holding it stationary. Some people that have replaced these, they know what I'm talking about. Is like a locking piece that's holding the clutch so it doesn't spin freely. So I have to check that out. But other than that, guys, looks like it is going to be a moneymaker. So look out for another video where it's going to be all finished. We're going to test it out, and I'll give you a final breakdown of what it costs to repair this thing. So thank you again for watching. Stay safe, be blessed, and I'll see you soon.